turn to Matthew 5. And we are going to start at verse 17. Matthew 5:17. I don't know how many of you guys didn't, you don't get on the internet, but I don't know if you guys saw that there was a video of part of the Sermon on the Mount. So it was a shorter teaching on the portion just after the Beatitudes, which kind of is talking about being salt of the world and the city on the hill.
One of your teachings?
Yes.
Oh, I haven't been.
Okay. Anyway, so that's there. That's kind of the conclusion of the Beatitudes.
Okay.
And so if you haven't seen it, I recommend catching up with that.
Okay. Where are you going, Matthew?
Okay, Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Okay. So so verse 17 through verse 20. Does anybody want that? Diane, go ahead.
Think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth. Until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven.
So obviously this passage is talking about the law. Now, remember I told you that there is an outline of the Sermon on the Mount that is contained within the Beatitudes. So the Beatitude, blessed are those who are merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And then the next Beatitude, blessed are those who are pure in heart, see God. And then the third one, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. So that is the outline for the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. So for the rest of chapter 5, starting at verse 17, all the way down to the end, this section is about mercy. It is about mercy. Or you want to call it love, we can call it love. In the book of Matthew, instead of using the word love, a lot of times he uses the word mercy. And I like that, especially in English, because the word love can mean a lot of things in English. Love is a very vague term in English. And there's at least 3 Greek words that all translate into love in English. And each of those Greek words means something very different. And so Matthew tries to pinpoint it a little bit closer. So instead of using the word agape all the time, he does use the word agape, but he also uses the word mercy. Say, okay, well, when I'm talking about agape, this is the kind of agape that I'm talking about. And Matthew is using a word that's used a lot in the Old Testament, which is basically the idea of mercy is you take someone who is vulnerable and you are helping them. You are providing them a benefit. And so Matthew is trying to say, when we talk about love, that's the kind of love that we're talking about. We're talking about providing a benefit to someone who is vulnerable. Something as simple as helping out a child. And that's something that almost all of us do at one point or another. Help out a child, and that's mercy. Because a child is someone who is vulnerable. And so we're going to provide some help for them. It could be something like helping the poor, but it could also be even within your own family. If you are over someone else, or you are in a stronger position than someone else, and that doesn't matter whether you're like a wife or a husband, your partner is going to be vulnerable or weak at one point or another. And when you are there helping them when they're weak, then that's the kind of thing that Matthew is talking about as far as mercy. Same thing in a church group, same thing out on the street, same thing everywhere. That's what's being talked about. And of course, Jesus is the one talking about mercy. Jesus is the one who's bringing it up all the time. It's just that in the book of Matthew, the word mercy tends to be used that way. So in this context, in chapter 5, all the rest of the chapter is actually talking about the law. All the rest of the chapter is talking about the law. And so we have some general comments here in verses 17 to 20, and then the rest of it is talking about specifics. I'm dealing with those specifics. Okay, because we're going to take each one. We're going to look at each one and look at how Jesus is interpreting that law through mercy. Okay, but first let's talk about these general comments that Jesus is talking about. These comments are brought up a lot, especially when trying to figure out doctrine. Everyone, when they're working on Jesus, they want to know what is the relationship between Jesus and the Old Testament. What does Jesus want us to do? Want us to do as far as the Old Testament? Does he want us to follow all of it? Does he want us to follow some of it, but not others of it? But I'll tell you, reading this, what does it sound like? Just doing, what does it say?
It sounds like we gotta do everything,
Every single bit of it.
every bit of it.
He's very specific.
Yeah.
I tell you until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke, which is I like the King James in this one, jot or tittle. Jot or tittle. And those are actually pieces of the Hebrew alphabet. Pieces of the Hebrew alphabet, little strokes within the Hebrew alphabet, or Aramaic, same thing, that we don't use, but I like jot and tittle. So it's kind of like saying, it's kind of like he would be saying the dot of the I or the slash across the T. Okay, that's kind of what he's talking about, those little teeny pieces. And so he's saying not even the smallest part of a letter will pass from the law until it is all accomplished. And whoever then annuls the least of these commandments will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. That's a pretty strong statement. A really strong one. And so it sounds like, and a lot of Christians have interpreted, man, we better be sure that we are following every single bit of the Old Testament law. Now, when they're talking about the law, when they use the word law or Torah, that could be a lot of things. It could be the whole Old Testament. It could just mean the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It could just mean the laws within the Old Testament, within the first 5 books. We're going to keep it simple. The laws in the first 5 books. We're going to do the minimum of what it might mean, although it could mean a lot more than that. Yeah.
He says law or the prophets.
That's true. He does.
He includes the
says law or the
prophets.
prophets. Okay. Okay, well then let me just say then, once again, we're going to stick with
Yeah,
the
we
laws.
don't have time.
But I do want to say, when Jesus says prophets, in a Jewish understanding, the prophetic books begin with Joshua. So we have sections where we think there's the law, and then there's history, and then there's prophets. In Jewish way of understanding, prophets begin with Joshua. So Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings are all prophets. The prophets, as well as Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all the minor prophets. However, in the Jewish understanding, Daniel is not a prophet. Go figure. Anyway. So, that's just part of the fun of history. Okay, but let's just set the prophets aside. Let's just focus on the law. And not only not going to focus on the whole of the first 5 books, let's just focus on the books for a minute. And let's play a game. All right, there are 613 laws. 613 laws, and that sounds like a lot, but try to count the laws that are in your driver's manual. It's probably about the same, and that's only a fraction of how many laws that we have that are organizing our society. So 613 is pretty basic. It's pretty simple. Okay, so I just so happen to have a list of all the laws right here, and they're numbered. Okay, 1 through 613. It's on the internet, and it would take a lot of pages to copy it out. It's an interesting read, though, and so if you really want it, I could print it out. What I want you to do right now is we're going to see whether we are good followers of the law or bad followers of the
I
law.
know the answer.
Okay, what I want you to do right now is just give a number between 1 and 613, and we'll find out how good we are. Okay, give me a number, any number.
35.
What's that?
35.
35. Okay. 35 says, do not give occasion to the simple-minded who stumble on the road.
What?
This is, by the way, this is a Jewish list. This is on for those of you who are on the internet looking at the video, this is www.jewfaq.org/613. Okay. Anyway, so it says, do not give occasion to the simple-minded who stumble on the road. In other words, to stumble. In other words, don't cause someone to stumble. Don't force someone to stumble. I think for the most part, we're all pretty good at that.
Wow.
Okay, so we've done well. Now let's do another one.
301.
301. You know what? I actually happen to know what that one says.
Oh.
It's not going to be good. Let's see here. It says, yes, I know exactly what that one says. The one who rapes an unbetrothed virgin shall marry her.
I know, right?
The one who rapes a woman, an unmarried woman, her. That is a law. That is one of the basic laws of the Old Testament. There's a lot of laws that are built on that.
I can
horrible.
understand why they made that law. I mean, why that was a law then. It's not a good law now.
Yeah, back then it was for her protection,
Yeah.
That
but
would
not now.
protect her and her
Yeah.
family and everybody else, but
That's a pretty nasty law.
it's a very.
That's an awful law. That's not going to be that one. All right. Any other number? Come on, give me another number. Between 1 and 613.
19.
590. By the way, I just want to say, I think we're all good on the rape law. We've all done pretty well.
Yeah, we haven't.
I have never raped an unbetrothed virgin.
Me neither.
Awesome. So we're good on that one. Okay. Did you say 519?
Yeah.
Okay. 519. Eat roasted grain of the new produce before Passover. Do not eat roasted grain, the new harvest of roasted grain before Passover.
So you have to wait once it's
You have to
been
wait.
harvested.
So if
you
it's
wait till after.
So if it's new grain, cooked or whatever, basically say we've got new grain until after Passover. If we have fresh bread, we could be in trouble, depending on how old the flour is.
Yeah.
We don't know how old it is.
I love it when it's hot.
We don't pay attention to that. So we don't know whether we broke that one, but it's a possibility.
It's a
I
Probably.
probably
It's a
have.
possibility. Okay, so, all right, give me another number.
65.
65. 65. This is a great game.
mhm.
That's how old I am.
65. Okay. A eunuch shall not marry the daughter of a Jew.
What?
A eunuch.
A eunuch shall not marry the daughter of a Jew.
No, isn't a
We're all
eunuch?
good on that one.
Yeah, eunuch is like a non-fertile guy. Right? I mean,
That's right.
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
been castrated.
Yeah, generally a person who's been castrated. That's right. Yeah, so don't marry, nobody should be marrying eunuchs.
Okay.
And so,
Now I'm gonna do the opposite of yours for my age, which is
so 56.
56.
Okay, 56 is do not marry a Gentile.
He wasn't a Gentile when I married him.
And that could mean do not marry an unbeliever. Or
Right, from our point of view.
but the fact
He
is
was
that
a
we're all
Gentile.
Gentiles, so
Yeah,
we all
so
get,
it kind of.
so we're
yeah,
kind of in trouble.
We're all,
I mean,
yeah, unless
do
we're
not-
Jewish.
yeah, do not marry a Gentile. Okay, so that's that one. Go ahead, give me that one. One more. We'll do one.
39.
39. You guys are going for smaller numbers. 39.
Can't count
If there
that.
is, this is an interesting one. If there is a beast that has fallen down, do not leave him unaided.
You're supposed to eat them.
No, no, no.
That
No, no, no. You're
was
supposed to
a
help
joke.
them.
That was
Yeah,
a
you're
joke.
supposed to help them. You're supposed to help them.
Right.
If there is a
There's a turtle on his back.
turtle on his back,
Turn
a
over.
dog that's fallen down, a donkey that's carrying too heavy of a burden,
That's a very sweet Bob.
then make sure that you cannot pass by without helping them.
Hmm.
Where's the milk and meat one?
Oh, yeah.
The milk and meat one.
Yeah, we all screw up on that one.
Yeah, no, and I didn't specifically look that one up, but the one that she's talking about, the law is do not boil a goat in its mother's milk. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
Right, but the way that the
It's-
Jewish
Yeah,
can't have meat and milk on the same shelf of the fridge.
that's correct. And so basically it's don't mix meat and milk. That's how they interpret it.
Yeah,
Don't mix
But
meat
that's not
and
what it
milk.
actually says,
No, it says do not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
which sounds disgusting anyway.
And we wonder who did that.
Yeah.
Yes,
Why
we do.
did that have to get
Who
this?
did
do.
that
That's a
to
fascinating
make that
law.
law happen?
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
Which
so
we do.
so I'd say in general we did pretty good. Now, most of these we haven't done. I will admit I definitely have passed by animals without helping them because when you're going 55 miles an hour, it's
Yeah.
harder to slow down and
It
help
is,
them.
yeah.
So I've definitely broken that one.
I've broken the bread one, I'm sure.
Okay, but we already looked at the one about the rapist has to marry the one that is raped. Let me give you a few others. Number 601 on the list is you are not to keep alive any of the Canaanite nations. They must all die. Their animal or child or young woman, every single one of them has to die. That's number 601. By the way, I just want to remind you, this is not just some random person. This is a Jewish standard list. This is the list that they recognize as the laws from the 2nd century AD. This is their summary of the law. This is what they understand to be the 613 laws. Okay, number 367 is do not wear a cloth of mixed fabric.
Cotton
So-
Polly, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
We all do.
So only 100% cotton. If it's mixed with anything else, it is against the law. It is against the law. Do
We
not,
should all be in jail.
You could do 100% poly, but that's against the fashion laws.
Exactly. I wish there was a law. Thou shalt not wear
Wear
polyester.
I remember that's what we wore when I first became a nurse.
Yeah.
Stuff's so
Yeah.
hot.
Oh, that's fine.
Number 316, do not make use of any idolatrous object. Now, an idolatrous object specifically is an image in worship. An image that is used in worship. It can be of the right God or it can be of the wrong God. It doesn't matter. It's still an idol according to Scripture. Now, every single one of us has broken this because we all use dollar bills. Because dollars are
We trust
images
God.
that are used in idolatrous worship. And we all do that.
Yeah.
the interesting thing is that in the ancient world, and the Jews in the ancient world, they used money, but they used money without images. Their money didn't have images that was used in idol worship, except for one, and that is the Roman coin, which had Caesar's face on it, which is the thing that says, you remember the whole thing in the temple, and Jesus was in the temple area, and they said, well, should we pay the Roman taxes or not? And he said, let me see a drachma. And they pulled one out. And he says, whose face is on this? And they said, Caesar's. Now remember where he was at. He was at the temple. It was absolutely illegal to have any kind of idolatrous image in the temple area. And they brought it in their own pocket. Well, not their pocket, but their knapsack. And then, and also, they broke this law because they're using an image of an idol all over the place. He was tricky. He was poking them. That's what he was doing. So in the end, what he was saying. So when it says, and then he says, okay, well, if it's Caesar's, if it's got Caesar's face on it, then it belongs to Caesar. And if it's his, then go ahead and use it. Okay, so what's the saying from that?
Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's.
Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. So he's saying, if you're using a drachma, you better give it up. Because it's not yours, it's his. It belongs to Caesar, so he better take it. In other words, if you're going to use an idolatrous coin, and you notice that Jesus had to ask for one. He didn't have one himself. He had to ask them for it because he didn't use those coins because they're idolatrous. Okay, anyway, so the thing is that it is all I'm trying to say is that that's a law that we all break because people use money in idolatrous practice. We use it we worship it. I'm saying it is used that way, and this law says not to make use of an idolatrous object. It doesn't say don't worship it. It says in any way.
I thought I said don't use it in worship.
That's what the second command says. Do not worship or serve an idol. This is a different command. This goes beyond that. Anyway, also I want to point out in the law it says specifically there are specific penalties for specific crimes, and that is also a part of the law. And so if you are a person who blasphemes God, you get killed. You get the death penalty for that. You get the death penalty for breaking the Sabbath. How many of us have ever broken the Sabbath? I don't know if Linda has. Nope, she says. But I'll tell you, the rest of us have.
Yeah.
Okay, because we worked on Saturday. You know.
How can everybody not work on Saturday? It's just impossible.
Well, you can do it, right, Linda?
I never have.
Well, I mean, everybody. It's just somebody's got to run the nursing homes and the hospitals.
And there is allowance for acts of mercy. So Linda would work at the Red Barn, would volunteer at the Red Barn, which is not breaking the Sabbath because that's an act of mercy. Okay, but working for money or working in a thing that is not merciful. So, for instance, farmers can go out and milk their cows on the Sabbath because that's an act of mercy. Because the cows will be in horrible pain if you don't do that. So that was an act of mercy, and Jesus points that out. You know, of course.
So all the people in the hospital should work for free on the Sabbath.
No, I don't know about that, but anyway. But breaking the Sabbath. So according to the law, you break the Sabbath, you get the death penalty. According to the law, you commit adultery, you get the death penalty. According to the law, if you disobey your parents, penalty.
I should have been dead.
if you disobey or curse your parents, then you get the death penalty.
Oh dear. Our children.
Our children.
Our child.
Well, the nice thing about it is that it is talking about adult children, not talking about young
Right.
children. So young children can curse their parents and they're still okay. But once they're old enough to know better, then it's a different story. Okay, now I want you to think about for a second about what Jesus is saying here. Then in this passage, he is saying, if anyone breaks even the least of these commandments, anyone breaks the least of these commandments. In other words, if I know an adulterer, I have to stone them. I know adulterers. I know quite a few of them, frankly. And if I'm gonna follow what Jesus says here, I'm gonna be like at the bottom of the kingdom of heaven if I break the least of these commandments. And one of the commandments is I have to stone an adulterer. Is that what he's saying? I do want to say one thing though. That is a very amusing book. And it is called The Year of Living Biblically, in which a guy took all of these commands and decided that he was going to incorporate them into his life over a period of a year. And so at one point, he was sitting down and talking to some guy on the bench, and the guy was talking about how he was an adulterer. He's thinking, I'm supposed to stone this guy. How am I supposed to follow this law? I'm trying to live all of these laws so that way I understand what it means to live according to these laws. And he would only wear cotton, and he followed as many as he could. And now he's face to face with an adulterer who he has not really had rubbing elbows with. And now he's like, well, what am I supposed to do? So you know what he did? He picked up some pebbles and threw them at him.
It didn't say how hard to stone him.
Just said or how big the rocks had to be.
Right.
It doesn't say that. So he picked up pebbles and threw them out. And this was a complete stranger. And so I bet the guy was kind of surprised that a complete stranger started tossing pebbles at his head. But anyway, if you ever see the Year of Living Biblically, hilarious. And it helps you, it kind of expands a little bit about what we're talking about today. Wow, there are some crazy laws in the Bible. Okay, so Jesus is saying basically, you do not annul even the least of these commandments. Don't, and yet some of these commandments are evil. Killing off babies, that's evil.
Yeah.
Killing someone because they said something unfortunate to their parents is evil. Forcing a woman to marry her rapist
Yeah.
is it's evil. Okay, that's a bad thing. If a woman is captured in war, then she is forced to marry her captor. That's in the law. It's a law. And all of this. And so, is Jesus saying we should be following these laws? And then there's the laws. It's not possible to follow. We are supposed to, according to the law, we are supposed to go to the temple and sacrifice every year. There's no temple. There hasn't been a temple for 2,000 years. So we can't follow that law. It isn't possible to follow that law. So how are we supposed to follow that law if we're supposed to follow all the law? Now, some people will say, this isn't talking about all the laws, he's talking about the moral laws. He's not talking about, so he's not talking about sacrifice. Talking about sacrifice or these kinds of worship things. He's talking about the moral laws. Oh, so moral laws like killing a kid who's cursing his parents, right? That sounds like an ethical command to me. But it sounds like we're talking about ethics here. And you can't look at a specific law and say, well, this is a civil law, and this is a moral law, and this is a worship law. You can, but a lot of them you can't. Why is it that people shouldn't be eating lobster? That's one of the laws. Can't eat lobster. Can't eat lobster, can't eat crab.
Anything that,
Can't eat shellfish. Yeah,
That's
can't
my
have shellfish.
favorite.
Can't have shrimp.
That's
Sorry, no
my
shrimp.
favorite.
Don't follow the law, no shrimp. Is that a worship law or a moral law or a civil law? Which kind of law is that? We don't know because we have no idea why it is that these were presented, because no context is given for them. It just says, don't do this. So we don't know what kind of law it is. So how are we supposed to make these kinds of determinations? Okay, and this is where we get in trouble. Okay, so there's a few things that I want to say about this passage, given the fact that trying to determine the law and I will say that Christians have been trying for 2,000 years to figure out this passage. Mm-hmm. So the Seventh-day Adventists say we need to be, and the church that you grew up in, they were saying, well, we need to be following the law in as much as we can. Their position. What they would do is they would pick and choose certain laws and say, we're going to follow these laws. And then there's other ones that we can't follow or we don't like or we think that they're kind of bad, and we're not going to follow those. So we're not going to kill our sons for cursing us, but we aren't going to eat shellfish. In fact, we're going to be vegetarians. Yeah, we're going to be vegetarians. We are going to follow the Sabbath law, but we're not going to follow. But we're not going to follow the one where a person who rapes someone has to marry them. We're not going to follow that one. Well, oh yeah, I know. And so, but then you end up having churches picking and choosing which laws they think are good. And that's a difficult. Because it seemed, I mean, I understand if you can't follow law, you can't go to the temple and sacrifice. That's not possible because there's no temple for us to go to. But
can't do the stoning either.
There's no stone.
Doesn't say how big.
It says to death.
Okay, it does say to death. That would take a while to do it with pebbles.
If it's impossible at all.
I'm going to kill you with gravel.
A spoon.
A spoon, yeah, that's right. Okay, anyway, so it makes it basically at that point we're picking and choosing. Are we following Jesus' command if we're picking and choosing? If we're the ones doing the picking and choosing, we're not. We're not following Jesus' command. Does Jesus give us a clue of what's going on? Yes, he does. And so let's talk about specifically and see if we can get an idea of what Jesus was talking about. Okay, so first of all, Jesus, not a single law is going to be until it is fulfilled. So we have two words, which we already been talking about law. So what about annulled and fulfilled? Now, annulled, on the one hand, could mean to deny it or to say that it's bad. But the actual word, it literally means to cast down, to throw down. That's what the word literally means. Which in general, it could mean to destroy or all that. It could mean a kind of a book burning thing. In other words, and so Jesus is saying, I'm not here to I'm not here to do a book burning of the Torah. I'm not going to get rid of the Torah. I'm not getting rid of it. I'm not here to get rid of it. I'm here to fulfill it. So what does it mean? What does he mean when he says that it's being fulfilled? Well, he means a lot of different things. Number one, it means that there's prophecies. He's there to fulfill the prophecies, right? He's there to make sure that it happens. It also means that he is there to, that if there's any part of the Torah, of the law or of the Bible that's incomplete, to complete it. Moses was not a perfect prophet. He was kind of an incomplete prophet. He led the people up to the promised land, not into the promised land. And Jesus is saying, I'm here to finish what Moses started and bring them all the way in. Because he's saying basically God's people are still outside. And I'm here to finish that job. I'm here to fulfill what began. There's all this stuff that began in the Old Testament, but didn't get finished. Finish his work. Joshua didn't finish his work because there's still all these enemies in the land when Joshua is done. And also David didn't finish his work because his work as he's kind of the first Messiah was to bring peace to the land, but he didn't bring peace to the land. Now his son kind of did, but his son also oppressed half the people in the land, and they were supposed to work for free for a good chunk of the year every year. And so he didn't bring peace to the land. Peace, and then he brought oppression as well. And Jesus is there to say, I am finishing all of this. I'm making sure that all of it is completed. And we see that, interesting enough, especially in the book of Matthew. There isn't any other book that spends more time talking about how Jesus fulfilled the law, not just did all the commands, fulfilled all the prophecies, but also Jesus is finishing the work of the people of the Old Testament. So Jesus is saying, okay, we're not supposed to annul any of the law until it's fulfilled. Jesus fulfilled it. That work is done. Okay, so
that means we don't have to go.
That means that we do not have to
Go
marry our
kill
rapists. Okay.
children and marry our rapists.
All right. Okay, so that's the first thing that Jesus is saying.
Okay.
All right. Secondly, none of us are to annul the law, interpret it in a different way. So we have at the end of this passage, he talks about the Pharisees and scribes. He says, if you are going to live rightly in the kingdom of God, you have to fulfill the law or obey the law better than the scribes and the Pharisees. How did the scribes and the Pharisees obey the law? They took each law apart, took it apart to understand exactly the meaning, and then applied it practically. So, for instance, the Sabbath law. They said we're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Okay, well then, what does that mean? It means that we're not going to work on our gardens on the Sabbath, because that is part of the work and we gain a benefit from that. Now, hold on. And so if we're not going to work on our gardens, we're not going to work on the land. Okay, so we're not supposed to harvest on the Sabbath because that's gaining food that's our work. What if you accidentally brush against some of it during harvest time and it falls down? Is that breaking the Sabbath? What about if you pluck it and then pop it in your mouth right away? Is that breaking the Sabbath? What about, and the Pharisees would go through and go through every single instance. What if you walked a mile? Is that breaking the Sabbath? What if you walked half a mile? Is that breaking the Sabbath? And so they would actually determine, one of the things that they did is give you exact measurement of how far you could walk on the Sabbath.
You don't have to go too many times. You use it all up.
I know. Anyway, yeah, you're only supposed to walk so far on the Sabbath. That's one of the
Wow.
things that they determined, you know? And the whole thing about the light switch is the idea of you're not supposed to light a fire. It says that in scripture, it says that in the law. You can't light a fire on the Sabbath. Well, electricity, the rabbis decided, the recent rabbis have decided electricity is a kind of fire. So you're not supposed to ignite electricity, you're not supposed to start an electrical circuit on the Sabbath. You can't turn on your lights. Would you hire a Gentile kid to go ahead and turn on lights for you?
Which totally gets. Misses the point.
Well, but what I'm saying is that this is what Jesus is saying, is he's saying that studying the law and trying to obey it isn't really obeying the law. Really obeying the law. If we, people of the kingdom of God, are supposed to be obeying the law, we can't be obeying the law. We don't analyze it to death and determine which things are the real thing and which ones are not. And Jesus actually shows us throughout the rest of the chapter, we are supposed to take each of the laws and then we interpret it through mercy. We aren't supposed to be saying, how nicely can I obey this law? What we're saying is, what is the merciful interpretation of this law? Single law that we're supposed to, so let's take the really nasty one. Okay, you're supposed to marry your rapist. So what is the merciful interpretation of that law? Don't marry your rapist. Okay, that's the merciful interpretation. Okay, it's the absolute opposite of the law. That's how you interpret it mercifully. And Franny was saying, well, I kind of understand how it was back in the day. Kind of, but not really.
Well, not really.
Okay. Although I do want to say that in that Genesis 24, Dinah, Jacob's daughter, was in a field. She was raped by a guy who took her to his home and offered to marry her. He didn't have the opportunity because Jacob's sons would have killed him and all of their community. But besides that, is that from Dinah's perspective, she might have wanted to marry the guy. We don't, and so, I mean, you know, times were different. But the thing is that what the Bible doesn't talk about much, because piece of literature, what the Old Testament doesn't talk about much is consent. What is it that the woman wanted? Would find it acceptable. And that's not found in the Old Testament.
Well, wasn't it partly also to protect her from just being society and stoned and never could marry anybody?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, it's supposed to be figured it's better to bury the rapist than it is to live in your father's house in the corner.
But your father has the option of making living in his house, because you won't be marriageable. He can't change that. Option of making living in his house bad thing.
Right.
If you have to remain there. So even then, necessarily have to be forced to marry a rapist if they were really looking out to do what's best for you.
Right.
Or the father could, on Congress, use another law and say, wanted to get raped, and
Okay, yeah, but
that was always an option too.
all I'm saying, really raped.
All I'm saying is that all the laws of the Old Testament, according to Jesus, have to be interpreted through mercy. So Jesus is saying, sometimes you're going to follow the Sabbath law, and sometimes it depends on the context. Jesus is not saying the Sabbath law is bad. He never says that.
Okay, what about the law of the shellfish? What's merciful about
Well,
eating
no,
that
but that, okay, and I think that there is a way of looking at that. There is a way of understanding that, because you grew up in a society or a culture that never ate shellfish and never had pork. It makes sense to do that. But if every time you get with your family, they're eating pork or shellfish, they're eating shrimp. I'm not sure why they But anyway, and to reject that is basically to reject your family. Well, then what's the merciful, loving thing to do in that case? Well, maybe it would be to go ahead and eat it. Jesus, there's flexibility to do that because every single law is to be interpreted with mercy. Now, here's the other thing: is Jesus sees the law, other body of laws, just like the United States law. So when Jesus is saying, when you the law that you're supposed to obey, you interpret that through mercy. It's the same thing here in the United States. Now, I would say that 99.99% of the time, the driver's laws are actually merciful. They follow those laws, because that's what's safe. That's what's everybody safe, you know? And so, however, there are going to be times that breaking the law, you know, so if you have someone who's desperately in need to go to the hospital, or they're bleeding out or whatever, get over there, you know, and generally the policeman pulls you over, they will actually help you because they recognize, policemen recognize that there are laws, that there are times that you should break the law just for other people, right?
They'll escort you and then they'll say, next time, call 911.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, they will. Yes, they will. Nevertheless, it's all I'm saying is that Jesus is the laws that we deal with. In that time, the law was the Old Testament law. Jews were supposed to follow that. And Jesus is saying, we do follow it, but we follow it interpreted by mercy. We don't just follow it blindly. And you know what? The Jews of his time already understood that.
Wow.
And they understood it in one specific instance for absolute. Which is that they almost never enacted the death penalty. That whole story about them coming up and throwing the woman caught in front of Jesus and said, Moses says that we're supposed to stone this person to death. What do you say? To death for adultery at that time. They didn't do it. So it was just, they were just trying to test him. They weren't actually interested in killing the woman. Okay. Anyway, and the whole thing about killing a kid of yours who cursed you or who rebelled against you, it's on the books. It was on the books. They didn't do it. Maybe they did in some far out villages, but in the urban areas and the main Jews, they didn't do that. There was no instance of it. In fact, actually, in the later Jewish literature, they said, "Oh, we haven't done that in hundreds of years." So they already understood the principle because they specifically weren't following the law because they saw some of the laws as being objectionable, as being too hard-hearted. And so, and to be honest, you know, you look at the later Jewish rabbinic, and we know that Jesus had a lot of arguments with Jews back in the day about whether a law was too harsh or not. All the later rabbis said, no, being kind is following the law. Being merciful is following the law. And so you have to do it this way. So they recognize that. Okay? All right, then we get to the third one. So first of all, Jesus said, Jesus himself fulfilled the law. It was fulfilled. That is not something that we do. Secondly, we are not interested in destroying the law. We don't need to burn the books. We don't need to say, although certain laws, I do say that. You heard me say that. But we interpret all the laws, any law that we follow, through mercy to determine how it is that we're going to follow, or maybe we don't follow it because it's not merciful. And finally, Jesus says, I'm not here to abolish the law. I'm here to burn them. I'm here to get rid of the law. The law is still going to be here. Instead, what Jesus did is he gave us a new law. He didn't get rid of the old one, but he gave us another option. And the other option is this: love. love God, love your neighbor. And if you're doing that, that's the option that Jesus gives us. He says you can follow the 613 commandments by mercy. You do that, or you just love. And that's the option that I'm giving you. God and neighbor, and so we're exchanging one set of laws for another. He says, I'm not getting rid of the other one. I'm not telling you that you can't obey that as followed by mercy. You can do that if you want to, but you don't have to, because there's another option. And the other option is to be in my kingdom, Jesus says, to leave the other kingdom away and to be in the new kingdom with a new law, and that law is love. And the only thing that is illegal in my kingdom is acting in opposition to mercy. And so Jesus, again, it still sticks with what Jesus said. He is not annulling the law, bring a new one. And I would say to you that when Jesus is saying not to break the least of the commandments, what he's really saying is, in the smallest way, do not break mercy. And the fact is that the rest of this chapter, he gives us example after example after example of dealing with a specific law and saying, you could just stick with this, but if you break it in the smallest way that is in opposition to mercy, then you've broken the law. Actually, what he's talking about. He's not talking about, are you breaking this law? Are you breaking the smallest? He's saying, are you breaking mercy in the littlest way? If you're breaking mercy in the littlest way, then you will be judged for that. And we're going to see that in the rest of it. We look at the specific examples that Jesus gives us. All right, does that make sense?
Mhm.
Any questions? Okay. All right, then we're going to say goodbye to our video people. Goodbye, video
Goodbye.
people.